with the whole idea, if you're going to go for 10% growth, let's just say wherever you are, 10% revenue growth, you really don't have to change a lot of your strategy. Like if you want to grow your podcast by 10%, you can keep doing most of what you're now doing, which actually is tough because it makes it hard to discern the few things that actually matter. Whereas if you make the goal 10x, it's very big, and that actually makes it really very powerfully discerning because very few things will help you to go 10x. And so it forces you to be a lot more honest with yourself. It forces you into what we would call 80-20 thinking, where you recognize that 80% of what you're now doing won't get you to 10x. 80% of what you're now doing is actually a distraction. And so it forces you to find those 20% and focus on quality, not quantity, and forces you to stop operating from your past.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Breakthrough Code podcast. We have an amazing guest. I've just been chatting with him before, read his book that just came out. It's phenomenal. His name is Dr. Benjamin Hardy, and I think you're going to really love his message. It might not make sense right away, but his latest book is called 10x is easier than 2x. And so I know everybody listening to this, because you're wanting to create breakthroughs, you want a 10x. You might not believe yet that 10x is easier than 2x, but I think Ben is going to prove it to us today. And I'm a big believer in that too. So he doesn't have to prove anything to me, but I hope that you will listen and really gain from his ideas. He is a organizational psychologist. He's got a PhD. He's written 8 books. And you can look at him, he's a pretty young guy. He's written 8 books, so he got started pretty early. And his books have sold nearly 1 million copies. Probably with this book that just came out, Ben, you probably surpassed that.
It'll be there soon, maybe. We'll see.
It'll be there soon, yeah. And he's 10x'd his own life. As a matter of fact, kind of a fun fact, he went from 0 to 5 kids in 1 year. Has anyone else done that? Probably not too many people, but his wife had twins, and then they adopted 3 children from the foster system, and now they have 6 kids. So he's taking it up another level. 6 kids, that's a lot of kids, Ben. I know that keeps you busy. Can't play man-to-man defense anymore, right? You got to go to the zone. So amazing person. I'm super interested in hearing from him, having read the book and love the concepts. So I was talking earlier, a lot of what he writes about fits into my belief system and what we wrote about in the Breakthrough Code. But Ben, welcome to our show. Really great to have you here.
Absolutely. Happy to be with you, Tom.
Yeah. So talk about, just give us an overview. Like, how could you even write a book on something as audacious as 10x is easier than actually just 2xing your results? Kind of give us an overview on this.
Yeah. So, this, I will say, originally this is it's probably not an original Dan Sullivan idea. I mean, I've certainly heard other people say 10 times is easier than 10%, even, because a lot of people are going for 10% growth as an example. I think a lot of businesses are, as an example, going for 10% growth year over year or quarter over quarter. So it's certainly not like Dan's not the only one who said it, but I learned this idea from Dan originally, and it was really just an initial idea. Just the idea that if you're going to go for 10 times growth, then you can't keep doing everything you're doing. And this fits with the whole idea. If you're going to go for 10% growth, let's just say wherever you are, 10% revenue growth, you really don't have to change a lot of your strategy. Like if you want to grow your podcast by 10%, you can keep doing most of what you're now doing, which actually is tough because it makes it hard to discern the few things that actually matter. Whereas if you make the goal 10x, it's very big, and that actually makes it really very powerfully discerning because very few things will help you to go 10x. And so it forces you to be a lot more honest with yourself. It forces you into what we would call 80-20 thinking, where you recognize that 80% of what you're now doing won't get you to 10x. 80% of what you're now doing is actually a distraction. And so it forces you to find those 20% and focus on quality, not quantity, and forces you to stop operating from your past. If you're going for 2x, or whether it's 10% growth or 2x growth, you're mostly just going to continue doing what you've done in the past. And so you're operating very linearly, and you're operating on past assumptions, and you're just essentially just continuing what you're doing, maybe just working a little harder, a lot more brute force. It's not creative. Whereas 10x is very forward sorry, it's not forward based, it's future based.
Yeah.
And so it's forcing you in the present or it's forcing you to take the future and use that as the filter for what you do, which is going to stop you from doing a lot of what you've been doing in the present. So yeah, it's a very powerful model. It really simplifies things. And it forces you into finding only the few things that really have big upside and letting go of most of the noise, which is what we're spending our time doing.
Yeah, no, I love that. There's a leader that I used to coach, and he was a leader in a big tech company. And what he would do is people would get their goals at the beginning of the year, and they're like freaked out because they're asking to go 20% higher than they went last year, right? And they're like, I worked my tail off last year, and now you're asking me to go 20% higher. And he would come in and he would have a conversation with each person, his direct reports, and he would say, all right, I've got a magic wand. Now anything's possible. And what I want you to do is I want you to imagine that you don't have to do your 20% higher. I want you to do 10x, so 10 times what you did last year, and now write out a plan for it. And you're right. When you do that, like, first of all, it scares people, a lot of people, right? Because I believe anything's possible. The subtitle of my book is it's a story about living a life without limits. I think we place so many limits on ourselves based upon what we think is reality, but the reality that we're seeing is just based upon a past version of ourselves looking out into the world. And we're here, I think, to create and to grow. So I love your book. But what do you tell people that question even their ability or the world's ability to, for them to be able to produce 10x? Because that you really have to buy into possibility to even embrace what you're talking about. How do you coach people on that?
Yeah, I'll share that, but I want to say that your example was actually really cool of what that leader was doing.
Yeah.
Because in the beginning, and it's like, okay, I want you to grow 20% next year. The reason that's painful on that person's brain is
Mm-hmm.
exactly what I was just describing earlier with like either growing by, call it 10% or even by 2x
Yeah.
is it's so linear. It's so marginal from where you're at that like that leader saying, I want you to produce 20% more.
Yeah.
That concept, it breaks their brain because it won't get them thinking creatively. It won't get them thinking non-linearly, which is what the 10x does. Instead, it just makes them feel like, oh crap, I've got to do 20% more than I did this year. And my schedule was already booked. I was already like really busy. I'm already tired. I don't have 20% more time in my schedule. And so they're already kind of feeling stressed and pressured going into next year because they're again thinking from the past and the present into the future.
Yeah.
Whereas his question about 10x is really cool because it gets them thinking non-linearly. It gets them thinking from the future, and the goal is so big that like they have to start thinking creatively different than what they're doing now, because most, if not everything they're doing now would not get them anywhere near that in a 12-month span. And so now they have to start thinking about different strategies, which are those few things with huge upside, which is really useful. And so the only reason I wanted to bring that up, and then I'll readdress your question, was I really look at the past as well as the future as simply a tool. Like
Yeah.
the past and the future, we're really lucky to be powerfully conscious beings where we have a past and that
Mm-hmm.
we have memories so that we can like learn things and hopefully
Mm-hmm.
improve our lives. But also we're really powerful in the fact that we can continuously frame and reframe again our past to get different meanings out of it, and to like move forward and gain more and more knowledge and stuff from the past, but also the future. So like the past is a tool, but the future is also simultaneously a tool
Mm-hmm.
for what we're talking about. Like a 40% upgrade is a bad tool for making good decisions in the present, whereas 10x is a much better tool because it gets you out of thinking what you're doing and forces you to think much more simply towards those few things that matter. And so I just think
Yeah.
that is really important to realize, that both of these as a tools is fundamentally for the purpose of you living well in the present.
Yeah.
Um,
Why
yeah,
are
go ahead.
Yeah, why are, in your opinion, why are people so addicted to defining themselves by who they were, by their past?
It's an interesting way you describe it as an addiction. One is that that's just their orientation towards time, is that they just assume that who they are is the byproduct of what their past was. They don't realize that their past is actually a byproduct of what they come up with in the present. So like memory is a reconstruction in the present. So who I am now, if I'm thinking about my life last month, I'm doing that for my current self, which is different from even who I was a week ago. So
Yeah.
psychologically, the past is actually more a byproduct of who I am now versus me being a byproduct of my past. But most people, they've kind of just been trained to think about their past as the driver of who they are.
Mm-hmm.
They also it's also a tendency for people to wish that things had been different. Like we tend to think that we could and should be somewhere further than we are, and therefore our past isn't what it could have been, and therefore we can blame our past self or blame circumstances and feel like we could have and should have been farther or better off or something like that. And that type of thinking puts the past in the driver's seat, and we're just the present is in a lot of ways the passenger to the past, and the past is the driver.
Mm-hmm.
And so it kind of it takes your agency away. It stops you from doing anything about it. Whereas if you shift it and you put the present in the driver's seat and the past in the passenger seat, as weird as that sounds, then you can continuously in the present utilize your past and reutilize it and learn more from it, even from, call it the last week. Maybe something this week didn't go to plan. Maybe something really tough happened, but you have to know that you in the present have large power to creatively shape what it means. And when you do that, then you become a lot more emotionally developed, a lot more healthy. You don't get stuck in the past. But yeah, I think that the addiction just comes from not being trained well. It takes a lot of emotional development to take creative agency over your past and to realize your past is a byproduct of you. You're not a byproduct of your past. Just
Yeah.
it takes work. That's really what therapy is, by the way. Cognitive behavioral therapy is
Yeah.
fundamentally about retraining you to reframe the meaning of your past. And most people just don't have that skill.
Yeah. And even going 10x versus, 10% higher, it takes a lot of work, but it takes more mental work. It takes working on yourself to get the even a belief system that 10x is even possible, because most people are not walking around believing that. They're believing that, okay, maybe I can get a little bit better, or my life can get a little bit better. The other thing, and I'm glad you said it, I mean, it takes work. It takes a lot of mental work. Your past is, can be empowering from great experiences you've had where you've had quantum leaps and things like that. So those are really great memories. And it can also be really confining from the times where I tried to go 10x and it didn't work, or, I got up and spoke in front of a group and nobody liked what I had to say. But those things we can let go of. We can reframe. We can literally have them fade away, but it does take work. Every day, if I'm not, I'm working on myself every day. And I'm 62 years old, so I'm quite a bit older than you, but I'm working on myself every day. And I think I'll continue working on myself till I take my last breath, because when something pops up and it doesn't feel right, I'm like, all right, what is it? Like if I'm going for something big and then maybe I have like a little bit of fear or doubt or whatever it is, I'm digging in, baby. I'm going to go in there and figure out what is that so I can let it go, because I know it's me carrying my past forward into the future, and I know it can block me. So it takes work. We have to do the work. How did you get this, take on this belief? I know you're friends of Dan Sullivan and you co-authored this book with him, but how did you start to believe, and maybe it was a long time ago, maybe it was something from your parents, how did you start to believe that quantum leaps and huge things are possible in life?
Definitely, definitely a lot of it had to do with like serving a church mission, like
Yeah.
going and doing service for other people, being out of my small little box. I grew up where I'm the oldest of three boys. My parents got divorced when I was 11, and it was pretty rough. It was a rough divorce, and there was a lot of chaos from me being age 11 all the way to call it graduating from high school at age 18, 19 years old. There was very little stability.
Yeah.
My father actually went through deep depression and addiction during that period of time, and so he was really struggling. And my mom was trying to run a business and stuff like that, and so we really had very little stability. And so it's not like I was, and that kind of stuff can really damage a person's confidence or belief about, when you get the rug pulled under you like that. And also I was not making progress. I mean, I barely ended up graduating high school.
Mm.
And so I did not have extreme degrees of, call it, confidence or self-belief. I actually tried to go to community college after high school and literally did not have the skill to do it. And so I dropped out. I tried to take 2 classes. And so definitely didn't have that. But when I went and served that church mission, a few really crucial things happened that I think influenced that. And then I've just been training it over and over since then. I've been back from that experience now for 13 years. But
Mm.
when I was there, first off, I was out of my space. And so I kind of could have a fresh start. I was in a new environment, a new role. I was doing new things. And a lot of it was service. I was doing service. I was also there was a lot of room for reading and learning. So I would read like scriptural books. I'd read um philosophy, self-development. Like I had a lot of time for reading
Yeah.
and introspection. I was living with someone, so like I had to learn how. It was in a lot of ways like boot camp. Like I was living with someone who I didn't know,
Yeah.
and had to kind of learn how to adjust to that. And also was really being challenged in my faith. Like, actually, do I believe this stuff? Like, sometimes when you're like knocking door to door and like having people slam the door on their face, like you have to really actually ask yourself, like, is this something I even really care
Right.
about? And so it forced me onto my knees in a lot of ways and asking hard questions. And I would say I definitely developed massive faith in a relationship with God, which is huge for me.
Yeah.
Which does increase, faith in a lot of ways is a very active thing. It's very much like you believing that you might not know how it's possible, but you believe that there's higher powers and other powers out there that can make things possible that are beyond your control, and you believe in those more than you believe in yourself,
Yeah.
or you believe in God more than you believe in yourself. And so that was very helpful. And then honestly, having lots of experiences. There's a book that I recently read that actually describes this quite well. The book is called Unreasonable Success by Richard Koch. Have you heard of that one?
I haven't. No.
So I'll just describe 3 of the principles he describes, but I see
Yeah.
myself in it, which is he talks about people who have achieved, he calls it unreasonable success. So like
Right.
these are people who it's a really high bar that he
Yeah.
describes in this book. We're talking about people who've changed the world. We're talking like Einstein and like
Yeah.
Beethoven and like
Yeah. Yeah.
Steve
Yeah.
Jobs. Like he's got this category of, Winston Churchill, stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um, and he goes through some of the principles he felt like these people had. One of them was like just an extreme version of belief in themselves. Like, for example, Winston Churchill believed that he would actually be the prime minister long before he did,
Yeah.
even as a teenager. Like, so second one was really high, or what he would call Olympian expectations. And so the expectation is different than belief in yourself. Expectations is belief that things will work out. Like the
Hmm.
expectations is in outcomes and in situations
Yeah.
that things will succeed, that miracles will happen, or that like, and
Yeah.
and and then the third one is what he calls transformative experiences. He said that usually 1 and 2 on that list, where you have high degrees of self-belief and also high degrees of high expectation. And by the way, there's a lot of research obviously that shows
Hmm.
um the expectations you have for things typically shape the self-fulfilling prophecy. But
Absolutely. Yeah.
transformative experiences are usually, like, he went through a lot of these people's transformative experiences and about how it was transformative experience after transformative experience after transformative experience, um, that really opened up those levels of self-belief and high expectation.
Yeah.
And then even having breakthrough wins, so like having breakthrough successes which build confidence. And so I would say for me, that mission was a huge series of transformative experience after transformative experience, and also observing myself. Certainly I was reading tons of books, learning lots of things, I was journaling
Mhm.
lots and kind of dumping out, like freeing my mind from a lot of the trauma.
Yeah.
But I was also having big success, like learning how to I was seeing myself do things I'd never done. And so I came home from that experience, probably mentally, spiritually, emotionally grew like a decade in that couple year span. And when I honestly came home from school, like college was easy. I flew through it straight A's, and had a lot more vision and ability to, um, to just to weed out the stuff that doesn't matter, get into really difficult schools, make really cool mentors. But I think that those are skills you develop, and you have to also continuously have transformative experiences and have wins that that are things you've never done before. That's
Yeah.
really how you build confidence.
Yeah, I love it. And transformative experiences aren't always like super fun, but they're necessary for us to grow into this person that can take on more. And so, you know, one of the things we talk about is, and you know, this is not me, unique to me, but the universe is always working in your favor, right? You know, that whatever is in front of you is there for a reason, and you can use it to transform, you can use it to grow, or you can, you know, back away from it and blame life and all those different things. So let's get tactical here. How can someone achieve more in 1 week than most people achieve in a year? What's the secret to that?
Um, I guess I'll break that down. So this idea assumes that most people are, for the most part, on autopilot. You know, so most people are going to spend. We already know that at least 80% of people's time is spent on stuff that really isn't moving the needle. Like that's the 80-20 principle in action. So, but also most people don't question their own assumptions. This is one of Elon Musk's pure principles or core principles, is that really before you want to like really optimize something, you have to actually question your assumptions, question why you're doing what you're doing, question, is this even the goal, or was this goal planted in me by society or by someone else? Is this someone else's goal? Why am I doing this? You know, and so questioning your assumptions regularly. People don't usually do that. There's also another quote that relates to addiction, Alcoholics Anonymous, which is, the quote is, all progress starts by telling the truth. Typically we have so many defensive mechanisms and layers that we distract ourselves with to numb ourselves versus telling ourselves the truth. And so to achieve more in a week than most do in a decade is actually not a high, is not a, or sorry, more in a week than most people do in a year is actually not that high of a bar. Because to achieve, no, seriously, to achieve more in a week, in that week is all you have to really do is maybe take a few steps of progress towards your genuinely desired goal. Like, and that requires asking really hard questions of yourself. What is your actual goal? What is the thing that you want, that you really believe in, that you really value? And how much of your genuine time are you spending towards that versus being distracted by society's goals, by your own addictions, and so I think that, you know, step one is honestly really questioning assumptions. Number two is being really honest with yourself about what you really want versus what what you care about, what other people think, etc. And so when you start really being honest about what you want and not needing it to be approved of by anyone else, then you're starting to be able to make one step in a true direction versus 5 steps in someone else's direction. That those two are very different things. I will give you one, so that's like journal stuff. Like actually like ask yourself some hard questions. Be really honest with yourself. What do you really want? How much of your life is actually going in the direction you truly want versus how much are you hedging based on what other people think? Once you really stop worrying about what other people want, you actually can start making dramatic progress because you're now no longer overly editing or worrying about how it's received. Instead, you're honestly just in a pure growth mindset where you're just honestly trying to get really good and figuring out how to get the result. I will say one more. I mean, there's plenty of tactics, strategies. Please go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, one really important point. Like, you know, you said that doing more in a week than most people do in a year is a pretty low bar, which is a little bit. I mean, it's true. I believe that too, but it's a little bit sad. Most people are on autopilot. So if you do nothing else, just listen to what Ben just said. Like, get off autopilot. Like, question why am I doing this? Why, you know, what do I really want? Am I just on autopilot like everybody else? Or do I want to do something spectacular? Do I want to make my life meaningful? And I just wanted to call that out. You know, it is a pretty low bar, unfortunately, right? But it shouldn't be, but it is. So continue on, though.
Well, is there any other notes you want to just share of anything that's popping up right now or staying? I mean, I'm happy to continue and share some thoughts on that specific topic, but is there just anything else right now that's standing out to you that you want to share?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. I think, you know, and unfortunately, I think even those of us who are, you know, working on growing, I get caught up in that sometimes. I have to remind myself to not, you know, overly focus on what everyone else is thinking. And I'm pretty good at it. I mean, I don't get caught up in that, very often, but sometimes I do, or sometimes I realize, hey man, I'm on autopilot. What the heck's going on here? Shake yourself up a little bit. So I don't care who it is. I'm sure Elon Musk, I don't know him. I know a lot of the tech leaders. I've coached, a lot of the CEOs of tech companies. I'm coming in and coaching them, right? They want to I'll actually be coaching someone later today. And so they want to get shaken up, and I think, we can do it on our own. We can do it through reading books like 10X is easier than 2X. You have to constantly be looking outside of you to get that reminder, shake yourself up.
Totally. And I like what you just said about how you've got to actually want to be shaken up. You've got to want to be, this is, I think, a really useful insight is that, and this is something that I learned from Dr. Daniel Gilbert. He gave a TED talk called The Psychology of Your Future Self. And he spent a lot of time studying the difference between your past self, present self, and future self. And one of the things he said in that talk, and this was a main stage TED Talk 2024, was he said that who you are right now is as fleeting as the present moment.
Yeah.
And so I think what's useful in that insight is that I know that who I am now, the person talking to you right now, I'm going to be different in an hour from now than I am right now. And so I don't need to overly defend my current assumptions. That would be actually what a fixed mindset is. Yeah. And so I can be open to the fact that I'm quite ignorant and that in an hour from now, I'm actually going to be a lot smarter. And what's even cooler is in an hour from now, I can look back on who I am now and I can actually discern the differences. And that's something I think is really cool is that I regularly right here, and this goes back to the idea that it's in the present that you shape the meaning of the past. Regularly, I reference back on my past self at different time frames. It could be 5 years. It could be 5 days. It could even be 5 hours, before this conversation. But I could look back, and I really do like doing it typically on either a daily basis or a weekly basis, and just looking back and saying, how am I different from who I was yesterday? What do I now know that I didn't know yesterday? How am I different from my former self? And also, what were some key experiences or wins that had never happened before that actually are showing me that I have achieved things that my past self didn't achieve?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that that's just a really important insight. Do you care if I share one or two more on the whole
achieve
go ahead. More?
Yeah,
and definitely want your insight, man. I know that you coach extremely high level people, and so I mean, I want to hear your thinking on this. Please go ahead.
Well, one thing I do want you to talk about. So, is like one of the things, and I saw in because I looked at one of your videos from something you did before. You said to 10x to really go big, you actually have to do less, not more. So talk about that concept of doing less. And also I love the story where your son, who's a tennis player in the book, talking about like, what do you want? Right. And, you want to play in college and you want to be a pro? Do you want to be a top 10 pro or whatever? And then, once he figured out he wanted to really go big, then the whole training plan that you had for him had to shift, right? He had to do less of the things he was doing and more of things that actually would get him to where he wanted to go. And I actually, after I read that, it was interesting because I had a conversation just with a friend's son who's a very good golfer, like a top junior amateur golfer. And I asked him, well, what do you want? Right? I always ask people, what do they want? And he goes, well, I want to be a professional. And I said, do you just want to be a professional or do you want to be like a top 10 professional? Right. And it's like, whoa, he's like, he hadn't thought of it that way. It's like, oh, I want to be a top 10. All right. Well, then that's radically different than just even being a professional. But talk about this kind of way of thinking and how you actually do less, not more, to get to bigger things.
Absolutely. So let me start with the Caleb story, my son Caleb, because these are similar principles, but they're also slightly diverse. They do lead to the same place that what you're saying, which is that if you want to go 10x, you actually have to do less.
Yeah.
That is a powerful principle, which we'll dive into. But what you're describing as well is that if the goal is really, really high, this goes to the idea that 10x is a lot easier strategically than call it 2x or going for pro.
Yeah.
Call it my son going for pro or your friend's son going for top 10 pro versus pro. Yeah. Having a much higher goal is actually strategically easier because there are less pathways to get there.
Right.
So I'll say that my son Caleb, who is a sophomore, 15-year-old sophomore, who wants to play college tennis, here in Orlando, there's an enormous amount of tennis academies, coaches, programs, and systems. And so if he wants to genuinely go college, there's a lot of potential options for how we can get him there. There's probably hundreds of coaching programs and things like that, even in our own city, in Orlando, because it's a big city for tennis, that would get him there. There's all
Yeah.
and there's a huge margin for error that he can have. He doesn't have to become that phenomenal. He does need to get good. And so there's things, he's going to have to get trained, and there is a path to getting there. But the main idea here is that the goal shapes the process.
Yeah.
And if he wants to go pro, if that's actually his goal, then that goal is going to shape a very different process, as you were just describing. And that process, there's not as many options to that process.
Yeah.
Like to the idea of here in Orlando, as I said, there's hundreds of coaches that conceivably could get him to the college level.
Yeah.
Because again, there's a much wider realm of possibility for that. But if he wants to go pro, I would argue there's less than 5 to 10 realistic coaches that could get him there. So
Yes.
again, higher goals have less paths, which actually make it more useful, because then you have to ask yourself, what are those few paths? What are those
Yeah.
few options? And it forces you to have a much higher bar and a much higher standard for everything you do. And so that's one of the useful techniques, is just that there's
Love
very
that.
few
Love
pathways,
that.
few pathways to 10x. And actually, and so I guess one thing I want to say on this, and this is something I've recently learned from one of my friends named Dr. Alan Bernard, and I interviewed him a great deal to write 10x. He's
Mhm.
a decision theorist. He studies constraint theory, but what he's really studied for 2 decades is how to achieve impossible goals. And
Mhm.
and there's a few really powerful reasons to actually set an impossible goal. In the case of my son, going for college is actually pretty conceivable for him, but if he was honest and if I was honest, he probably doesn't believe he could go pro. But there's actually benefit in setting a goal that you don't believe is possible. And the
Mhm.
reason for that is that if you set a goal that you genuinely believe to be impossible, what that
Mhm.
means is that you right now don't know how to do it.
Mhm.
And if you don't know how to do it, then what that means is that you can no longer rely on your past assumptions on how
Yeah.
to get there. Whereas if you do believe you know how to do it, then you already think you know how to do it. Therefore, you're going to just continue to operate from your past knowledge and be probably pretty dogmatic and not question your assumptions. But making your goal impossible forces you out of that, and you have to go find those few pathways that might get you there, because it's such a high goal that most things won't get you there. And
Yeah.
so it actually invites a lot more divergent thinking and a lot more openness to those few paths with extreme upside. And so it's a very useful tool. So
Huge believer in them. Yeah,
that's
I'm
the
a
one thing. I
huge
don't know if you
believer.
want to comment on
No,
that
I'm just
pathways
a,
component.
but I mean, no, I'm a huge believer in that, like, to create a breakthrough result, I don't call them goals, because goals seem aspirational, results seem already done. So I want to create more of an expectation in the mind, but a breakthrough result, it should be something that when you put it out there, you don't know how to get there. Like, that's what true growth is. But trusting that there are resources, there's energy, I believe we have this super conscious mind that's connected, to, it's not residing in our body. I can think of you, and I'm not saying this happens all the time, but then you might email me like, why I haven't heard of
Oh,
you in
that stuff's
months. Like,
powerful. That stuff is
yeah.
deeply true.
Yeah. And so I believe there's a way. Actually, Tony Robbins used to tell me that, there's always a way. I remember, I was in my 20s, I was running sales and marketing for his company, and we'd have some big result, and I'd try all these things, and I go, hey, I don't think there's a way we can do this. He goes, no, there's always a way. There's always a way. You just haven't found it yet. And that was really a great lesson for me in my 20s. There's always a way. So set big, huge results that you want to accomplish, see them as accomplished, and then the way will show itself. And you just have to have that level of trust. So I love that. I love what you just said. And now, if you could address the second part of what we
I
were just
will. I
to,
will. I do
yeah,
want to make a secondary comment on what you just said,
yeah,
because it's very powerful. In psychology, there's a concept. There's two concepts I'll describe. One is pathways thinking. People who have high hope, and hope in a psychology sense is different from optimism.
right,
Usually we think of hope as pretty weak, actually. Like, I hope it happens, but in
yeah,
actual psychology, true hope is actually based on commitment towards a goal.
Uh-huh.
And so like commitment actually firms up hope. And when you're highly hopeful, you have this sense of agency, one sense that you can that you have some form of like control over what you can do and what happens, but you also have this component which they call pathways thinking, which is that when the why is strong enough, you will find the how. So that fits with Tony Robbins' comment of there is a way. I also love the quote that winners will find ways. And but when it comes to really impossible goals, as you're describing, and I'll go into that secondary concept, but it's really powerful to be working towards something that you don't know how to do it, because then obviously you're not on autopilot and you're trying to figure it out. And if you're trying to figure it out, then that means your brain's actively solving it, and you're breaking down old assumptions, and so that's the secondary concept, which is called selective attention. Dan actually has a beautiful phrase for that. He says your eyes can only see and your ears can only hear what your brain is looking for. And so once you actually start trying to solve it, figuring it out, asking questions, genuine questions, it's kind of like when you decide you want a certain type of car and you start seeing it everywhere, now you're selectively seeing it, even though it may have been there all along. Now you're actually starting to figure it out. And now that you're trying to actually solve it, you actually can solve it because now you're working on it. Whereas in the past, you wouldn't have even thought about it because you think it's impossible. So therefore, you're not even thinking about it. So it's just incredible. Like our brains are really powerful. And also once we actually start working towards something, like Tony said, or like you said, of course there is a way, but you will actually find and figure out or create that way if you get really committed to it. And it'll take you in very different directions than you've been going in the past. That's why we call it nonlinear.
Yeah, I love it. And that way is not always just your brilliance. I believe that information comes through us, right? Resources show up, things happen. You met Dan Kennedy, right? Now you're the author of actually 3 books with him, like,
Sullivan, but yeah.
Dan Sullivan. Sorry about that. Yeah. The author of 3 books with him. And the people that I at least I find the people that you need when you have belief and you're committed and you're searching and you're growing, they will show up. The resources, the ideas, the intuition. I'm a huge believer in that. And I've had so many instances in my life where it's happened, and taught it to my children, taught it to so many other people. And even in jobs, like, I coach people that are pretty aspirational in their roles where they're going for big, CEO jobs and they've got lots of competition. And I would say not 100% of the time when they go for them, do they get them, but a very high percentage. And a lot of it has to just to do with their level of expectation, their level of belief, their level of having a vision for something that they can really bring in and add value where everyone else is just trying to get a job. So I love everything that you're saying. I'm a huge believer in what you believe in. Take us through there's 3 concepts in the book. Can you take us through those and just talk us through those before we have to sign off here?
Which concepts did you want to hear?
Well, so number 1 is scaling your identity.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And then number 2 is upgrading the quality. And we talked a little bit about this, upgrading the quality and decreasing the quantity of your attention. So stepping away from things. We talked about that a little bit already. And then the third one is transformational leadership. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about scaling your identity a little bit. I know we've referenced that a little bit, but what does that really mean to scale your identity?
Absolutely. So you, as you even mentioned prior in this conversation about people's call it addiction to their past self, most people's most people's identity is actually framed from their present or their past. Very few people have an identity that's operating from their future. People with a growth mindset typically are actually more identified with their future self than their present and their past self. Because if you have a growth mindset, then you're not overly defined by who you are now. You actually are not that worried about who you are right now because you know that you can learn, change, and grow. And so you're actually a lot more connected to your future self and who you want to be. And you're actually letting that identity dictate what you do here and now. So that's part of scaling your identity. And obviously having what would be called psychological flexibility, where you're continuously letting go of your former self. As I was saying earlier in this conversation, I know I'm not my past self, even a day ago. And so I don't need to make the same decisions my past self made. I can also question the assumptions my past self had with no judgment towards my past self, simply a recognition that that's just where I was back then, but I'm no longer that person now. So having the and that goes back to just, emotional flexibility and development, which is just learning to let go of the things that were who you were but are no longer who you are, and certainly not your future self. And then it also does take pretty high psychological flexibility to connect with that future self, mentally and emotionally, and then letting that future self be the driver of who you are and what you do now. That kind of shifts you from doing to more being, where you're being your future self. You're being and doing what they would do, not what necessarily the current version of you would do. And that you can get better and better at that. I mean, as an example, and you, a lot of it just is in line with getting connected to your future self, who you want to be, getting really vivid about it, seeing your future self specifically where you want to be, but then operating with, like you said, even the assumption that that's who you already are. I remember when I first started blogging online, and this was back in 2015, and my clear goal, call it my 10x jump, was to become a professional author. I had never written a blog. I had no website, but I wanted to become an author and get book deals with the major publishers so that I could provide for myself and my family.
Yeah.
And I would very deeply, I had somewhat of a pre-performance routine that would get me into the state of my future self. And I would honestly just write from as my future self, that I was already writing as a professional writer. And so I kind of, and it really sped things up. But I guess one other thing I'll say, there's two quick things I want to say, and then I really want your thoughts and commentary on it as well, which is there's two other really crucial components of scaling your identity. Obviously being connected to your future self and operating as your future self, as I just described, and letting go of the past self. But the other two is, and this comes to scaling, is if you give yourself space, where you're not overly busy, you literally give yourself space to think. And as you said earlier, your thoughts really can bring back really interesting things, even if you're thinking about specific people. And so a big part of scaling your identity is actually scaling up the vision in imagination, actually having, like, messing with it rather than, just say if your goal is to make $1 million this year, to actually play an imagination with 100 million, like, and actually think about it. That goes back to the idea of actually think about it, imagine it, and you don't have to be attached to it, but like that's actually scaling your identity and your mindset. And so just thinking about really creative, interesting potentials.
I love that. Yeah.
The last one I'll just share, and then again, I really want deep your thoughts on this, but so what I'm describing is elevating your imagination. But the other component, and this is more on the subconscious side, is actually raising your floor, which is what which I would call your minimum commitment. So like we all have minimum standards or commitments, and this is actually a big part of identity, which is one way of looking at identity is it's that which you're most committed to as a person. And another way of looking at that which you're most committed to as a person is your standards, which is what you actually say yes to. Yeah. And you can observe those standards by just watching your behavior. So if someone is scrolling on social media for an hour, obviously that was their standard because they're doing it. Right. And so when you raise that floor, when you dramatically raise that standard, where like you could do it in the terms of what you say yes and no to. It could be, for example, in a business sense, it could be that I will not take any clients below this price now, even though maybe I've never had any clients at this price. Yeah. And now you start getting offers at the old price, and you could now ask yourself, okay, am I going to say yes to this because it's a quick win, because it's secure, because it's what I'm used to? Or do I now say no to that? And I say, no, this is this new standard. And if they don't accept it, then you're comfortable letting it go. And I think that when you raise that floor, and that could be on professional, it could be personal, you're no longer going to do X, Y, and Z that you used to say yes to because you've now raised the floor. When you actually watch yourself do that, that's where you start shifting old subconscious patterns, and that jolts your confidence, watching yourself say no to that, because now you're really saying, I believe, this is the new standard I hold myself to. And that really ignites your belief in what's possible.
Absolutely. And I hope everybody reads the book, because you've got some great case studies in there with businesses that, had clients, customers all over the board. And then when they raised their standards, they actually let go of part of their business, but because it created a new identity, they were able to free up time, resources, focus, go after the clients that they really wanted, and the businesses exploded. I love also that you brought in imagination. One of my favorite, two quotes from Einstein. First of all, he said, imagination is a preview of coming attractions. But then he also said imagination is more important than knowledge, because knowledge is based upon everything that's already been done. Imagination, you can imagine things that have not been done. And when you start to imagine it, that the way that I work with athletes, the way that I work with people in business, it starts to become true. You start to form a basis for the resources and the ideas to come to you to make it true. And if you imagine it with feeling and belief, and it becomes and the more you make it feel like a natural extension of where you are to go to that, the naturalness, I think, is really important. So if you're imagining it and it feels like a pipe dream, that's one thing. If you're imagining it and it becomes your reality, it's a whole nother thing. I had a friend that was an accountant in New York City, and was a young guy out of college, fast tracked in a big accounting firm, and he didn't like it. And so he's walking home one day and he walks past this Navy recruiting office and he sees this poster of, it didn't say Navy SEALs, but it was Navy SEALs, doing all this cool stuff. He goes in, he goes, I want to do that. The guy goes, what do you do? He goes, I'm an accountant. The guy goes, nah, don't forget about that. That, first of all, they only take 2 people outside of the Navy every year that are civilians to even try out to become a Navy SEAL. So, go back to your old job. The guy's trying to talk him out of it. Go back to your old job. You're fine. Like, you don't even want to do that stuff. It's really hard. It's grimy. It's dirty. It's not that enjoyable. And all he heard when that guy said, there's only 2 people we take out of the civilian, all he heard was, I don't know who the other guy was, but that's one of my spots. But he went back, and with his imagination for 8 months, he carved it into his imagination. And he said, if he didn't hear anything, like, he'd filled out the app, he didn't hear anything. But 8 months in, he had carved it so deeply into his imagination that he had this feeling of certainty. And he wasn't reaching out to anybody, but he had this feeling of certainty. This had to be his new identity, this new path. And then he gets a call 8 months in. Hey, I don't know how you got it, but you got the spot. Not only did he get the spot to try out, this was so carved in his identity that out of 170 people, 17 graduated in his class. He was the honor man, the number 1 person. And not only that, you get assigned to a boat crew at the beginning, and he was an officer. And then as people drop out, you typically have to take on different people, or you change another boat. His entire boat crew graduated intact, which is unheard of. And so the power of scaling your identity, and to do it, you have to get uncomfortable. Like, I think you studied Richard Wiseman too, the professor or maybe, I don't know if you did or not, but he studied why people are lucky. And he said one of the things that lucky people do is they try things that are not congruent with their past self. And he wrote a book about luck. I read it years ago. I was studying it. And they'll do things that are uncomfortable. They'll take different routes home, even though they know a route.
Is it called the luck factor?
Luck factor, yeah. And they literally are always upgrading their identity. They'll read a book that they normally wouldn't have read. I actually read that, and my wife was going to a book club. This was years ago. And I said, I want to go to your book club with you. She goes, no, you're not going to enjoy it. It's just ladies. And it was some, I can't even remember the name of the book, but it was a very popular book, but it was about this lady that left everything, traveled to India, and it was a #1 bestseller. I hadn't read it. I went to it, and my wife was like really uncomfortable having me come. But it was interesting. I just tried something that, wasn't natural for me. I think the more we can do that, like opening a door with your left hand instead of your right, it just puts us in a mode where now we're open to all the things you're talking about, getting us to 10x. So, but I love that you addressed imagination. I think it is the most powerful tool we have to really create our future.
It's also the same tool you actually use to create your past. As weird as that sounds. No, seriously, exactly. It is. I mean, to frame and reframe and to choose meanings and to choose lessons and learnings is not by accident, it's by choice. And so it's not by chance, it's by choice. And so Yeah, I think I've actually never heard the initial quote that you gave, which is imagination is everything. It is the preview of life's coming attraction. I've never actually heard that one. I've heard many times imagination is more important than knowledge,
Yeah, yeah,
but
yeah. Yeah.
I think it's huge what you're describing, and it fits a lot with the model that I've understood, which is you have to go from thinking to feeling to knowing, which the knowing side is more that certainty or confidence that you're describing. But thinking, this is one of the things that many people just simply don't do. So back to my son, Caleb, back to your friend and his son. If my son is thinking about his future self as a college tennis player, that's going to not only shape his identity, but it's also going to shape his process. It's going to shape the mentors that he works with. It's going to shape literally his daily practice, what would be called deliberate practice, versus if he was going for pro, that would reshape where his selective attention, his eyes are focused, thinking, feeling, knowing. And one of the things that's spoken of with all the research on future self, which is that concept of imagination. Most people just really don't take the time to imagine their future self. Most people assume their future self to be the same person that they are today. So they're actually taking the present and projecting it onto the future rather than imagining a future and projecting that future onto their present, which is a lot more powerful. And it's a lot more of a higher filter. And back to kind of a lot of the notions we've already had in this conversation, which is if the goal is really imaginative and also seemingly impossible, then the filter's a lot higher. There's a lot less options. There's a lot back to what you were just saying, you're going to have to go and do different things than you've been doing because almost nothing you're doing right now is going to get you to that impossible goal. And you can only find those few levers that are going to have huge upside. And, to some of the conversations we've been having around to go 10X, you actually have to do less, not more.
Yeah.
If you're going for 2X, you really are grinding and you're doing a lot of things not well. You're doing, you might be decent, but it's really the difference between good to great. If you've read Good to Great, you have to let go of the good. Good is the enemy of great. And so if you want to go 10X, you really can only have your mind and your attention on very few things, which you actually go 10 times deeper into. You go deep 10X, which actually makes it possible to go up 10X. And that means that your mind really can't be focused on so many things. You have to remove 80% of the things off your mental plate so that you can go deep, so that you can do something that has the potential to be that great. And anywhere you look at anyone who's done made massive strides, it's because they actually got 10 times better at something very specific. And they were either highly skilled at it or highly innovative at it.
Yeah. And they've stopped doing a lot of other things so they could get better. Hey, listen, everybody, pick up Ben's book. 10X is easier than 2X. If you're a business person, if you're an entrepreneur, if you just want more in your life, it really is a phenomenal concept. And it's been proven over and over again through your work and Dan's work. You've helped entrepreneurs and all sorts of people make massive leaps in who they've become and what they've done. So this is not just theory. This is actionable. There's great stories in it, even starting with Michelangelo in the beginning, right? Telling the story of how he made all those leaps. Very interesting story that you started out with, Ben. So pick up the book. Where else can they find you, Ben? I know you've written other books, but where else can they find you and your work?
Yeah, I would say as an invitation to anyone who's listening to this, 10X is easier than 2X. If you read the intro and it literally does not blow your mind, please just put the book down. I genuinely believe if you read the intro and you're open to some of the stuff we're describing, you'll very quickly start seeing your past, present, and future very differently. And it'll start to help you find those much simpler pathways to 10X than maybe you found before. But yeah, I think in really simple terms, simply just go grab the book. The audiobook has 3 hours of bonus interviews between me and Dan Sullivan. I have definitely written plenty of other books, which if interested, go check those out. But Benjamin Hardy is my website, benjaminhardy.com. If you want to shoot a comment, I do have a YouTube channel, as was said. You could just look up Benjamin Hardy on YouTube. So that's about it.
Outstanding. Well, hey, thank you for writing this book. It was an amazing book. It made a big impact on me, reinforced a lot of what I believe with real examples, and just amazing work. You are an incredible author. You've accomplished a lot already. I love the fact that you are so proud of being a dad and you're raising 6 children. That means a lot. That was my most important job on the planet. I've got a 30-year-old and a 27-year-old now, but I always thought, business success, sure, but if I fail at being a dad, like that's not acceptable. So I really admire.
There's actually a great quote on that. There's a great quote on
Yeah.
that stands out to me. It says that no other success can compensate for failure in the home.
I love that. I love
no
that.
other success can compensate for failure in the home.
Yeah. And the fact that you not only have children that were birthed by your wife, but the fact that you brought in 3 souls to be part of your family, and now they get to benefit from all your wonderful knowledge and work, and just amazing.
I don't know if they benefit from it yet. It's very hard to teach your own kids stuff. It's like they don't want to hear it from dad. You know what I mean?
That's true.
But hopefully I can build a good relationship with them. You know what I mean?
It seems like that, but seeing them come out the other end, 30 and 27, and
you can see that they absorbed some of it.
They heard it all, and they're really on a great path. And I know your children will be too, and they're blessed to have you as their dad. So Ben, thanks so much for being on with us. You really are a powerful young man, and I love your message and love everything you're doing. Thank you so much.
It means a lot, Tom. Thanks for letting me be with you.
Yeah. And so everybody, if you enjoyed this podcast, please like it, and then also tell all your friends about it. If you're watching on our YouTube channel, please subscribe, and we'll see you again. Thanks for being part of the Breakthrough Code podcast. Have a wonderful day. Keep living your life without limits.